Hi, I'm Etta Spencer. And on the last Sunday of every month, Project Save the World has been holding a global town hall meeting for activists everywhere in the world who want to get together by Zoom and just talk about whatever is on their minds. By activists, I count, of course, largely peace activists because that's my own background, but also people who are working on global warming, on famine, on pandemics, on massive radiation exposure from radioactive contamination, on cyber attacks, and then on the social and economic and governance reforms that need to be made in order to allow real changes to be made in solving all of these problems as a package. So you never know who's going to show up. I invite anybody. It's very open, and we just talk for a couple of hours, and then out of the 2-hour conversation, I make an extract of about an hour and put it online for people to watch if they're interested. So today is the last Sunday in September 2020, and we have a conversation going on. As we enter this conversation, Philip Bogdanov is speaking about his concern as somebody nowadays active in work on biodiversity.
His idea is that we should use the silica and sand to make glass and then make floating platforms that are mirrors that reflect some of the heat load, the sunlight, back into space, and that we can do this gradually and in a controlled fashion and in places where we won't upset. We can do it in a distributed fashion around the world and different parts of the seas so that we don't create any localized heat imbalance by shedding too much heat in one space. But he says that's something that could scale up relatively inexpensively and would buy us some time to get the CO2 back in place by shedding that heat. He says, so far people are thinking that the CO2 and the heat, the climate warming, are coupled, but they don't need to be. And in the past, life on Earth has tolerated as much as 1,000 parts per million of CO2. So
I would think that the amount of heat that's required to make huge amounts of glass might be exactly the thing we don't want to do.
Well, he's saying basically you use these, I think they're called CSB, concentrating solar plants, where you can, make a, 1,000 acres of mirrors focused on a furnace at the center, and you can basically make glass that way. Being seriously at starting an ecosystem restoration camp. This is the idea of identifying a local area that needs restoration assistance and assembling a team of volunteers that would, perhaps be on site for a month or two at a time as volunteers, a team of maybe, 2 or 3 dozen with various skill sets. They would basically camp out and then help, regenerate the area, doing things like creating swales, following permaculture principles, replantings, and as well by demonstration and going out into the community, engage the broader community into supporting their initiatives and to learn from them, and so that they would be a catalyst site. So most of these are in brittle ecosystems on degraded lands. So soils are our biggest repository of carbon and probably, some between 1/3 and 1/2 of the CO2 that is currently in excess of the 300 parts per million has been contributed through land use change.
Is it? Catherine, I think you're...
Yes, it is Catherine Winkler.
Meta.
Hello, Mukti. How's everything in Kathmandu?
The cases are rising every day, almost from 1,500 cases each day.
1,500 for the country, for all of Nepal?
Yeah.
It's not a high death rate from it.
Yeah, well, it's almost 300.
I understand India is also having a bad time of it right now.
Maybe the government is planning for another lockdown. It's almost like 6-7 months.
Uh-huh.
People who really are on daily wages, I think they are the ones who are suffering.
And they're finding that, like with the common cold, your immunity disappears sometimes as quickly as 2 months, 4 months. So you may have it and shake it off, but it can come back, and sometimes it comes back worse. So the only real solution right now is safe distancing and masks. And we're already seeing that people are growing weary of those restrictions and wanting to go back to work and school and restaurants.
It's a perfect time for people to work in their gardens because plants don't get it. So Montreal's been very good about asking people to have a 6% green area in the front of their house and 40% in the back. It really helps with the heat in the city, but it also helps capture carbon and keeps people busy so that they aren't out talking to other people there. I wanted to ask a question. Maybe Philip knows what's happening to farming the sea. They used to have this idea that you could grow algae in the sea and it would absorb the heat.
In the ocean itself, there's a periodicity to that gyre, and then because of the heat balance in the summer and the winter and the fall, there are shifts in that current which allow deeper currents to come up, and when those deeper currents come up, they're carrying nutrients that in turn allow the phytoplankton to bloom, and then the fish eat those. Anyway, so people are trying, most of our aquatic systems are under great stress. There are a number of projects, I'm aware of 2 in particular, that are trying to address this, primarily through creating kelp forests. There's a guy, first name Bren, working out of Connecticut, that is attempting to develop floating platforms. They're sort of lattice work. Initial prototypes are made out of PVC tubes, but they basically float just below the surface so that they're safe from shipping, but they provide an upper end to ropes that would then descend 30, 40 meters into the sea to provide a place where kelp and barnacles and other fish, crabs, etc., can attach. And they also have a mechanism whereby the wave action works a very simple pump. There's a very deep pipe that goes down into the cold water. It has a valve on it, and the up and down motion basically pulls that cold, nutrient-rich water up to the upper surfaces and spreads it out over this lattice work to provide nutrients and a habitat. And the idea is that his primary motivation is sequestration of carbon in the kelp forest. Kelp's one of the fastest growing plants on the planet and can hold a lot of carbon, but it also provides habitat and food for many other things. So it would help, if there are enough of these, they can draw down carbon and restore fisheries.
Why is a lot of the ocean a desert?
The central parts of the Great Seas are nutrient depleted. Anything that grows there, even temporarily, eventually dies. And when it dies, it sinks to the bottom and it takes all those nutrients with it. So it's only by the mixing of waters from coastal, from deep ocean, and occasionally you may have seen some of the National Geographic reporting of the dust storms that go from North Africa east and end up, sort of fertilizing the Caribbean area. That's another mechanism whereby nutrients reach the ocean, and shortly, about 10 days after those dust storms, they start seeing increased algal activity in the upper waters of the ocean. But it's temporary, so it's just too deep. There's not enough.
Yeah, but these platforms are going to somehow enable the water, the algae or the kelp to grow.
Correct. And initially they'll be in the continental shelf as well. Maybe they'll go up, into farther into the ocean. But the farther away you get from shore, the harder it is to maintain them, of course.
I guess I didn't get how these platforms help the kelp. It brings up water from the depths.
The first thing they do is they provide a floating substrate that the kelp can attach to. And then, yes, they bring up, through this pumping mechanism, they bring up the nutrient-rich water and use it to sort of fertilize all the life that's attached to that platform.
Oh, okay. Now, I have had conversations with a guy named Paul Beckwith in Ottawa, who's a climatologist. His notion was that the business of sprinkling iron filings in the ocean, which would enable phytoplankton to grow and then to sink to the bottom. And
the idea is foremost to restore fertility to the ocean by doing this. I guess he determined in certain areas iron is a rate limiting nutrient, and it very cheaply can be distributed. And then there's a bloom, and then the fish get fat and happy, and the people who are harvesting the fish get happy. But yes, ultimately the blooms die back, and they have, through photosynthesis, captured some carbon, CO2, either from the air or from the water, and when they die, that sinks to the ocean floor. So that's a natural way of sequestering the carbon.
Liz, I see your name, Liz, but I don't know which Liz you are, and what you have to say for yourself now. Mm-hmm.
Well, I don't have any knowledge of any topic. Personally, I try to let my yard grow, and I have a lot of insects, but the neighbors keep dusting their crops from airplanes the past 3 years, and there's no mosquitoes left. There's only one frog left that I know of on my yard, and so that's discouraging. But I've planted a bunch of native flower types, and those have attracted a bunch of insects, including hornets.
Where do you live?
In a rural area outside of Omaha, Nebraska.
Oh, well, good. So the crop dusters are killing the mosquitoes, which is killing the frogs, which is upsetting you.
Yeah, we used to always have a period every summer where the roads would be covered with little baby frogs, and the past 3 years we haven't. So I'm assuming the EPA is allowing some kind of really bad poison now.
Oh, well, my goodness, I hadn't ever bothered to develop my empathy with frogs before. But I understand that the species of frogs in the world has been declining, that apparently there's a great loss of frogdom.
Amphibians.
Yeah, right. And so they eat mosquitoes, and we want to keep some mosquitoes so they will live. Is that the idea?
I guess so. I mean, I'm not an expert on them. I mean, it's nice to wander around outside without getting bit by mosquitoes, but we used to have like little frogs scooting around on our patio door at night, and this year, none.
Okay. I would have been happy about that, but now I will not. Okay. Well, thank you, Liz. I'm glad. Welcome here. And Catherine Winkler, who's, I think, must be in Halifax, right? Hello, Catherine. Tell us what you're up to these days.
So I just was it Claire or Barbara, did you mention the August 6th Hiroshima Day?
Yes, I did. Mm-hmm.
It was Barbara. So in Halifax, I'm a member of Voice of Women for Peace. And I'm really interested in all these conversations, the frogs and the salmons and the nuclear bombs. And we managed here in Halifax to have the mayor sign on as a city to the ICANN appeal, encouraging Canada to sign the ban treaty. So that was one thing that happened. Then there's so much in terms of the Mi'kmaq fishing rights right now. There's a lot of upheaval that they're not being recognized. There are protests against the Indigenous fishermen exercising their rights to fish out of season lobster fish, and so their treaty rights are being challenged again, although there was a decisive decision, the Marshall decision, I think, when an Indigenous man it went to the Supreme Court, and it was recognized that according to the treaties of peace and friendship, the Mi'kmaq do have the rights to fish out for a moderate livelihood outside of the season.
I was reading, I haven't heard anything about this year, but
Good year for
I was
lobster.
reading last year that they just had too many lobsters.
Yeah,
If for
it's
some
never a
reason-
good year. Meta, it's never a good year for the lobster. Let's just be honest. No.
Well, yeah, but I mean, in terms of lobster fishing,
Lobsters
but
themselves.
apparently last year they had almost more than they knew what to do with. And I don't know whether it's the climate or what.
I said that as a tongue-in-cheek, but I mean, it is a perspective that we take. Do we take the perspective of the lobster or the human? So that was a little, you know.
Somebody's got me so far as to be concerned about frogs, but you're going to have a hard time getting me to pity the lobster.
We also are involved in trying to organize for November 11th, trying to decide whether to be part of the Remembrance Day service, which is with our white poppy wreath. So that's an ongoing conversation, and that ties in again with that resistance and that the narrative of militarization and to me, you know, misguided masculinity.
Now let's hear about that. Do they want you? Do the red poppy people want to have anything to do with the white poppy people?
The red poppy people and the white poppy people are all one. But they don't know it. And so
that's the problem then. Okay. But I mean, are they what's the dispute? Who's objecting to whom? Is it the white poppy people who don't want to have anything to do with these militarists who go around wearing red poppies? Or is it the red poppy people who feel that the white poppy people are not properly respectful of the sacrifices made by the soldiers who got killed?
Well, I think you framed the question very well in a way that it would have been framed by saying that there are two sides. This isn't, for me, isn't a useful framing anymore because it doesn't apply to the way I perceive the way things are. So what my hope is that what we're trying to do is to work together. We have, as our group of women it has contact with a group of veterans who are running a farm locally here near Wolfville in Nova Scotia, and they are completely funded by the Legion. And the Legion has, I think there've been in the past exactly that oppositional view that you've mentioned between the red and the white poppy. So we're hoping to work together to have a ceremony at the Grand Square, the Parade Square here in Halifax, but not to interfere with the traditional ceremony, but to have it in the afternoon, which still may be controversial.
Yeah, because I think really what it comes down to is whether or not wearing a red poppy and doing all of the ceremonial things surrounding that amounts to glorifying war and thereby in a way legitimizing or encouraging it. I see Barbara shaking her head, so I have stepped on a toe.
I don't see why you can't wear a red poppy and a white poppy together. You know, that you got you recognize the horrors that happened, and you're working to make sure they don't happen again.
Well, I remember one time I was asked to be a speaker at a Remembrance Day ceremony in a high school, and it was, of course, the whole high school came together, and there were other speakers. I was the last one, and they were talking about, you know, the wonderful soldiers who did these wonderful things that saved us, and we were there to remember them and, you know, honor them. And I said in my speech, I'm here to honor everybody who was killed in the war, everybody, the victims of both sides or all people who were injured or killed in the war. And I had the feeling that I really crossed a line, that this was not quite an acceptable message. Nobody quite scolded me, but I did have the feeling I'd violated some basic premise of what this was all about. No?
Excellent, good job. That's the way. Yeah, don't let them get away with the idea of a hero worship for the people in the war, because we in Montreal we have go at the same time as the Remembrance Day service, and we wear white and red poppies. And well, some people just have white, but the service has been getting smaller and smaller. We keep complaining that we don't want cannons because it scares the babies, and it has been getting smaller every year. But we like to be there right at the same time.
They used to fire cannons?
They still do.
Oh, okay.
We shrouded our cannons last year. We had a ceremony and we had crocheted shrouds for the cannons. Oh. And it was a lovely ceremony. And it is to honor the civilian victims and the refugees and the child soldiers. It goes on and on, because the real face of war, of course, isn't represented by the red poppy. On the other hand, it's not to dishonor the choice of a person who has that patriotic view.
Okay, good. Philip, can we go back to our the topic that I really want to explore with you? I believe the Alan Savory notion that you have to have large herds of animals and you have to treat them just in a very particular way. That if you do that, that is the best and maybe the only way of preventing desertification of the soil around the world and restoring fertility to the land, etc. And this is if you're going to raise these animals, you're certainly going to eat them. Nobody else is going to raise animals. But most of the people say we should become vegetarians because animals emit methane. But I believe I've seen your name on some of the Facebook social groups as somebody supporting the regenerative grazing approach that I just described, which comes out of the work of a man named Alan Savory in Africa.
I'll make right off the bat just a recommendation. There's a book that's come out in the last couple months by a nutritionist and a researcher. It's called Sacred Cow. If you go to sacredcow.info, you'll find out about it. And they are attempting to address a lot of the arguments that you've just raised. I will say, one, I'm in favor of all of us sort of shifting towards a more plant-based diet. I think one of the forces of destruction has been the impetus to raise meat or the products that grazers eat in the concentrated animal feedlot. Most cattle are, for half or 3/4 of their life, raised on grasslands. Some are increasingly finished, so you'll see grass-fed, grass-finished, to make that distinction, that where they're not fed any or hardly any sort of grains to fatten them up. And those cattle herds are typically or increasingly managed under what's called holistic planned grazing, as a way to kind of use domesticated herbivores to mimic the patterns that wild herbivores followed for millions of years. One of the first talks at our first conference in 2014 was by Professor Greg Retalak, R-E-T-A-L-L-A-C-K, who is an expert in fossilized soils. And he basically, his career is focused on the coevolution of grasses and herbivores. And when that happened in our Earth's history, the Earth was actually cooled by the interaction of those species. So grasses are unique in that they don't grow at the tips, they grow at the base, which enables them to survive when they are grazed by herbivores. And that process, because of the patterns that were followed, herds subject to predation would not stay in one place very long. They would eat the rich green lush grass, They would stand around peeing and pooping until it just got too stinky, or till the hyenas or the lions or the tigers found them, and then they would move on. And they might not come back to that piece of ground for a year. It's part of their kind of migration patterns, or certainly many months. And that gave the grasses a chance to recover, to grow more, to incorporate the dung and the urine back into the nutrient cycle of the soil. The animals themselves, particularly if it's what's called a brittle environment, which means that it doesn't get rain, it's mostly a dry ecosystem. It may only get rain once a year or twice a year for brief periods of time. The cow, the herbivore's stomach is actually the carrier of the fungi and the bacteria that then get pooped out onto the ground and help to enrich the biodiversity of the soil and make it able to capture more carbon. So what we've learned in the last 15, 20 years is that soil is alive and the health of that ecosystem, there's, a tablespoon of soil is supposed to have more than 9 billion organisms in it. I haven't seen the actual paper that sort of catalogs that, but that's the number you hear, kind of rule of thumb. But those, largely fungi and bacteria in an equal ratio in a healthy soil form a symbiosis with the plants. In fact, the fungi first colonized the earth, and then the bacteria, and then the plants came ashore from the oceans. So it wasn't until the fungi and the bacteria had sort of prepared the ground, so to speak, that plants were able to get the nutrients that they wanted. You put a seed on a rock, it doesn't have the ability to extract the nutrients from that rock that it needs. But if there's a matrix of soil, that soil has in it fungi, some species of which have acid-eating tip that actually will etch into the rock or a grain of sand. There's if you search on it, you can find electron micrographs that show, what looks like a highway, huge, messy highway system crossing in a single grain of sand where the fungi have etched tubes through and extracted the nutrients. As when the white man reached the Great Plains, there were 6 to 10 feet of topsoil that had been grown through partnership with the buffalo and the antelope and other herbivores over many eons. And what do? We killed off all the buffalo and we started plowing up topsoil, basically mining the nutritious mineral content, but at the tillage agriculture basically exposed the soil to sunlight and heat and oxygen. So as I said earlier, a significant portion of the CO2 that we've added to the atmosphere has come through that process because we have reduced the organic content of soils tremendously. There's another number going around that I think needs to be updated, saying because of the mining that we've done to our soils, we only have about 60 years of crops left before we've exhausted the fertility. So Alan Savory over time became to realize that, before domesticated herds of animals were there, the grasslands did fine, because of this back and forth between the grasses and the grazers. And so they've learned to mimic that.
How much controversy is there really remaining about that?
So as you probably know, peer-reviewed science moves slowly. And, as someone once said, paradigms change one death at a time. When the old way of thinking gives way to the next generation. So there's a lot of anecdotal success, but there are a growing number of papers, peer-reviewed papers that are now coming out that basically justify these methods. We're acting as an aggregator of the information.
Who's we?
Biodiversity for Livable Climate. So that's I'm a member of the board of directors, and I'm also a volunteer director of the DC chapter. But
Biodiversity for what?
Livable Climate.
And I did a talk show. I do a weekly talk show with somebody about some issue, And I did one with a guy named Tom Newmark a month or so ago, who runs this, it's called the Carbon Underground. And he has a farm in Costa Rica where he applies and experiments with these methods. So I asked him pretty much the same question I asked you. Is this really controversial, or is the evidence now supporting, the savory methods? And he was quite emphatic. And the odd thing is, he says, look, I'm almost a vegan. He said, I personally hardly ever eat meat, but I believe in that you have to use we need more animals. In other words, we actually have to use these methods on a large scale in order to combat the desertification of the soil globally. And so he's totally in favor of that technology.
But Alan Savory is making the argument that we need to reclaim the amount of degraded land, the desertified land. It looks like a desert, but it was created by the abuse of humans, maybe thousands of years ago. But we now know how to fix that. But yes, it does, in that instance, require the use of animals.
Now, these animals poop and fart and belch and create methane. The question is, how much damage do they do with their emissions of methane compared to the service they provide for the soil? Is this measurable? Have people really been able to quantify it and give a definitive answer to that?
Well, the planet did not have a methane problem, and there were tens, 20, 60 million buffalo and antelope in North America. There were more wild animals than are currently in these concentrated animal feed operations. So the issue is not the animal, it's how they're managed. And the fact that, especially when you feed them grains, you exacerbate the methane production. You've got it in, a very unnatural, unhealthy environment for the cattle. When the cattle are out grazing on the land, the methane, most of it comes out of their mouth because they're breathing and they're, four stomach rumens, whatever. Most of it is sort of belched. And if their mouth is close to the ground, a lot of that is captured by, in healthy soils, what are called methanotropic bacteria. So methane feeding bacteria will digest some of it. Some of it, yes, does escape, but it's distributed. Sunlight affects methane, breaking it down into carbon dioxide. So all of this was part of the natural cycling. It's when we've kind of pulled out, turned the cattle into a factory, pack them all together where the methane becomes a waste product rather than integrated into the ecosystem. That's when it becomes a problem.
But I'm finding this conversation really captivating on how we have been treating the animals and how now the earth has, and that there are solutions. So it's a very hopeful conversation that you're having at the moment.
Well, if there are solutions, it's going to require a lot of change of public opinion, especially among environmentalists and people worrying about climate change.
Right.
Because one of the main things that people recommend is let's stop eating meat.
Right.
And you're not going to have herds of animals unless you have use for them, So
well, we do have to reduce our meat intake, but there are people indigenous peoples come to mind who depend on hunting and other sources of food.
Yeah.
And if we do eat meat, try to support the farmers who are actually drawing down carbon.
Yeah. Yes.
Right.
So look for the grass-fed, grass-finished.
Yes.
A lot of, like Safeway now sells grass-fed. Unfortunately, most of it comes from Australia or New Zealand, so there's a carbon footprint attached to it. But you can, in the Washington, D.C. area, I know, at least 10 places where you can buy 100% pasture raised, meat. So those things, you may have to pay a little premium. You may have to, go through a few more hoops to make sure you get it or whatever. But those are the people that I think are at the leading edge of doing this restoration. And, what Alan Savory is talking about can be done with wild animals that we don't need to eat.
True. Yeah.
But there needs to be some sort of financial investment in that. And it's not going to happen unless, we educate our citizens to elect leaders that will make that investment. In the meantime, there is an economic model using ranchers where they will have to slaughter the cattle. But one of the other questions that you may have posed to you, Meta, is the morality of it. And people say, I don't want to eat meat because it means killing an animal. Well, if you're eating soybeans or other things like that, it also means killing animals. They're just not as big as a cow. And maybe you don't have as much control over the quality of their life because they're subject to the herbicides and pesticides and everything else that's making their environment toxic. So, there are lots of gray areas in this conversation, and I think each of us needs to kind of get informed and then make our own choices about how much meat we eat and where it comes from and what are we supporting, what are we voting for with our dollars in terms of where we want the world to go.
Well, Project Save the World is about 6 different threats, one of which is famine, another is global warming. So all of these, these are areas in which the question of diet and the question of how to sequester carbon come together, and it's very much in our bailiwick. But so far as I know, there's nothing yet that we can call a real social movement among environmentalists or climate change advocates or activists that corresponds to a real debate or real discussion about these issues. And that's why I've asked Phil to elaborate so extensively on this. And in fact, that's only scratching the surface because I got a whole bunch more questions that I'd like to discuss about that. And one of them has to do with the fact that the greatest amount of permafrost that is melting in the world, and really one of the greatest dangers and probably the most urgent danger in the world now, has to do with the melting of the permafrost, which contains, decayed plants and things of that sort, especially in the Arctic. Any cold area has permafrost, and Canada has about a third of Canada has permafrost at various times of the year, but the Arctic in particular does. And certain areas of the Arctic are very, very heavily loaded with carbon from past times, and this is especially the case in Siberia. So if you look at a graph of where the carbon in the soil is in the world, the huge amount of it is in the Arctic, in particular in Siberia. So we have to be concerned about the fact that this carbon in the permafrost is melting and releasing methane because the bacteria come back to life and starting to have a picnic with all of this decaying stuff that's unfreezing, thawing out. And these bacteria create the methane, which then gets into the atmosphere. And this is going to be a runaway situation. We already know about problems about the melting of permafrost and the clathrates in the bottom of the oceans, and so places like that, where these ice crystals full of composed partly of methane come back into the atmosphere, melt and get back into the atmosphere, and how a runaway situation is likely to happen there. People who worry about any climate thing, I think one of the top issues that we have to be apprehensive about now as an urgent matter has to do with the release of methane. It certainly is. I think we have to make this into one of the issues or the component of the issues that activists address in a comprehensive way.
Carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is a symptom of how we've been treating ecosystems around the world, and that way of thinking also has been showing up in how we treat other people, right? So they're related in terms of the mindset, the problem solving, the dominance of one culture over another. There are no jobs or justice on a dead planet. So that's the ultimatum that we're facing in terms of, of course the planet's not going to die, but the conditions that allow human civilization to thrive are being threatened daily, and we're seeing the results of that. So the question for me is how do I, humbly engage with these other communities that I think do have very important, maybe not as urgent, but equally as important issues to address. How they're, a Black person lives in a very different culture than I do because of the prejudices and the assumptions and the economic disadvantages and the siting of waste and nuclear power plants in poor communities that don't have the voices. But I want those people to recognize that this is an urgent priority issue, and I want you to also be engaged. So my question that I'm wrestling with is, how do I do that? As a Quaker, I start with listening and asking questions, but I also feel some sense of urgency in wanting to, not have those movements be so narrowly focused. So how do we engage in that dialogue? How do we bring them along? How do we become their partners by lending our voice to what they're trying to do?
You have put it much more gently, but in a way it's a variant of the thing that haunts me, which is, it's a variant, but it's not exactly the same thing. You're saying, well, anyway, my thing is this. I think that the people who are causing the worst trouble in the world, for example, the people supporting Trump and all of his policies, which I think are absolutely lethal, it's going to kill us if we don't straighten it out. Those people are motivated by a sense of resentment, a resentment toward elites and toward people who think they know things that these people don't even pretend to know, and who look down upon them for what we consider a backward culture. Uneducated hicks, country hicks, or other unsophisticated people. And this is, I think, a very large component of the resentment, which is the motivation behind the support for Trump and so on. And so for me, the dilemma is, I believe I should not be disrespectful. I believe that even for achieving the political goals that I have to somehow extend, be more inclusive, be more accepting, be more tolerant, being more, definitely overcome any looking down upon other people. And yet the truth is I do. I mean, I really do regard them as, backward, unfortunate, cultural relics of a bygone era that I hope they'll smarten up. So the truth is I am disdainful, and it's my own, I don't know how to stop being disdainful. I don't know how to be that inclusive and to be more respectful toward people whom I really don't respect. And that's not quite what you're saying. You're saying more of a compassion for people in the Black community who've been deprived, and that's easier. It's easier to do that, but it still is a matter of bridging cultures where there really is a gap there, and I don't know how to overcome it. Are we talking about the same thing or totally different issues, Philip?
I think there's a spectrum, and I also recognize there's this growing divide politically, and particularly in the U.S. around, as you say, this the Trump supporting camp that resents us. I've seen a couple of things where people kind of describe why they don't want to listen to us, and et cetera, et cetera. So I guess one of the other bridges in terms of not just people of color, Black, Indigenous, whatever, is also those at the lower end of the economic spectrum, which has only gotten deeper. We've seen greater and greater divides of wealth. So
it's not just economic, it's educational spectrum. And,
right.
Anti-science and
but some
all of these cults like this QAnon and things, all of these things represent a kind of uneducated mentality that I think is just pathetic. But how can I be respectful when I'm dealing with something that I absolutely abhor?
So I think some of the product, I'm not a historian, so maybe others know better, but I think it's because our educational system has been impoverished, that we haven't been able to devote the kinds of resources to educating those people, to training us all in how to have civil dialogue, how to have discussions where we do have disagreements, but we are still united largely by the common goals of health and a better future for our children. So, one of my mantras when encountering that is, you go through the open doors. You work with the people that are supportive of you, but I think the bigger picture is that somehow we do need to address these flashpoints in our culture, because the climate changes are just exacerbating and will be increasing, and acceleratingly so, the stresses on our cultures, and these the resentments and the fears are just going to contribute to the conflagration. We can't ignore them.
There are other peace people here, who may have a handle on this, which I have, what I'm doing is acknowledging my own ineptitude. As a peace worker, I'm pretty bad at. I'm not very skilled. So, Margaret, do you have thoughts about this, or Claire?
Did allude to the education system. And that's happening in Canada too, as you know, Meta. Increasing privatization of our education system, healthcare system, has an effect on people's lives, some more detrimental than others. So I don't blame people personally. Cultural divide too, but something that I've been hanging on to that Philip said earlier when he talked about basically the globalized economy and the global supply chain, jobs and justice, and the economic inequality there, having to import grass feed for our animals in North America when it could be done domestically. So if you're talking about jobs for ordinary people, that would be looking at the system as the globalized economic system as well. It's a system change that we need at so many different levels. But I was smiling when you talked about your disdain versus resentment, and that these are very human qualities to have. But to understand it's not personal; it's happening at the political level. So not to blame people, but to look at the systems that have informed or misinformed people. And education is crucial. A decent public school system, that's what we need at every level.
question is, what would you teach in that school system? I think, basic civics needs to be taught more. But I basically think that, I've never been much of a Marxist, because to be a Marxist really kind of, to me, means reducing everything down to the economics. That it's poverty that's the problem, or it's lack of access to resources. That's the problem. And I really don't think everything can be reduced to that. I think I've been always a Weberian in the sense that I think it's jockeying for status, for prestige, for dignity, for rank in society that is more powerful to more people than their economics. So I don't think that, yes, of course it's important to increase equality, but just increasing economic equality doesn't overcome the fact that different religions, different ethnic groups, different rural communities, different, there are all kinds of factors, gender, a number of things affect a person's ranking in society. And that is always a comparative thing. People look at each other and they think, how am I compared to this person? My brother, he's doing better than I am, or my cousin, or this person I went to graduate school with, are they higher in their, career than I am? And resenting and envying and all of these things. It's not about money. It's really not. It's all about rank. And I have to sometimes even tell myself, stop paying attention to that kind of thing, because everybody can start doing it. You can compare yourself to other people with invidious ways and start, thinking, well, I should be honored much more than I really am, or something. And this other person who got an award, I should have got that award. You can think that way, and it's a really bad mindset to be in. But more than a bad thing psychologically for the person, it's the source, I think, of the worst tensions, the societal tensions that we have. So when people simply don't want environmental regulation of pollutants, for example, or they want to have guns, they believe it's a human right to have a gun, or some of these other symbolic things. It's not that they're materially and better or worse for having a gun, but symbolically it's a status that our culture as hunters and so on, that should be respected. So I don't know. I'm hung up on this, and it's where I'm sure in my own mind that this is the kind of issue that we have to be better at handling as peace workers.
Well, you're touching on a lot of things, but cultural divide, rural and urban divide. But the common denominator is just common decency and dignity and respect for people who are the essential workers. We've discovered during COVID that, for example, I'm just thinking the garbage pickup guys that come every week, these people are essential, and they should be remunerated in ways that we have livable incomes for people. And so I think it's not all economics, no, but it would certainly help if everybody had a decent basic income. Also, all the volunteers out there, retired people too. It's intergenerational. So we have to begin somewhere, acknowledging differences as well, but we have more in common than not.
I'm not really going to comment on the current subject. I have a lot of thoughts on it, but it's not something I want to delve into in this current chat, but I did want to ask Phil about his connection to Gene Sharp that he mentioned a while ago. But
So I was one of the first staff people hired by Gene Sharp at his Harvard program on nonviolent sanctions and conflict and defense. And I also was a board member of the Albert Einstein Institution that we set up as a way to kind of have an independent base outside of Harvard. So yeah, I worked, I don't know, 3 or so years with Gene. Very informative period of my education working with him. He had a number of fellows that were doing research on, documenting, Central American resistance, overthrow of dictators. He had, a couple of people in the U.S. and a couple others in the U.K. going back to primary records looking at the American Revolution from the point of view of a campaign of nonviolent resistance. I don't know if you're familiar with that study. A book came out of it, basically more or less establishing that at the time of Lexington and Concord, when violence broke out, 8 or 9 of the original 13 colonies had already achieved de facto independence from British rule through, non-cooperation. Gene was sort of an expert at taking something that might initially appear to you to be a defeat and sort of teasing out, how it was a success, how doing the mental jujitsu to take what looked like it was an overwhelming, defeat to tease out that there was a principle here that if it could be applied, it might actually undermine the opponent. What else? So we also had a big translation effort, getting, condensed versions of his work. The first one is largely looking at in defense of democracy, how to defend against coup d'etat, getting that into many different languages, and him meeting with a variety of people.
What was your role there?
I was general administrative support. One of the people that came knocking on our door was Mubarak Awad.
Mm-hmm.
He basically, he told his story of, going to school at Bluffton College, where he first kind of encountered Gene's ideas, and he initially poo-pooed them because he was pretty much in the camp of the PLO, supporter of the PLO. But he, Mubarak himself, specialized in sort of at-risk youth, getting a PhD in psychology and establishing first in Ohio, the Ohio Youth Advocate Program, and which got replicated into 4 or 5 other states, basically training people to help largely teenagers who had, drug or pregnancy or other kinds of issues in the States. And it was very successful, and he thought he would take it back to Jerusalem and the West Bank. And he led he established a program and found that it met with less than what he desired in terms of receptivity. And in thinking about that, he realized that the delinquency or, rebelliousness of the youth was not so much the same kind of problem that he experienced in the States, but was more a result of the occupation of the Israeli authorities. And so he then drew upon what he had learned in that class about Gene Sharp's methods, and he kind of on his own set up a Friday night, Saturday, Sunday session in Jerusalem. Initially it was be hosted at the YMCA, where he had some connections, and he thought, maybe 20 or 30 people would show up, and I think over 200 people showed up. And the Israeli authorities got wind of it and basically pressured the YMCA to tell Mubarak that he could not hold it at the YMCA, otherwise the YMCA risked losing its operating permit and would be kicked out of the country. And so they apologized to Mubarak and said, we have many other programs that go on here, so you'll need to find another place. So he found a place to meet in Ramallah, and quickly let everybody know, and they took either public transportation or so forth to get there on Saturday. And then on Sunday, those people were told by the bus drivers, sorry, we can't take you to this place. So they had to get sort of private car service to get there. About a month later is when Mubarak showed up on our doorstep at Harvard and said, what do I do next? And so Jean in our program kind of became an advisor to what Mubarak did, and basically said, you need to establish a center, but you need to give it a name that is not threatening, and you need to conduct programs that are kind of just below the radar of the Israeli authorities. So it was called the Palestinian Center for the Study of Nonviolence. But he amassed, a library of writings, Martin Luther King, Gandhi, and so forth. And he started, hosting people and giving talks about nonviolent resistance. And then he himself kind of started leading the Monday boycotts of Israeli goods, and then the strikes. And then there was one particularly egregious episode where there had been a site dedicated to Martin Luther King, where they had planted an olive grove of saplings, and then in the dead of night, the quote-unquote Israeli Conservation Corps came by and uprooted all the saplings and basically stole them for another site. And Mubarak basically...
Oh, they took them. They didn't just break them. They stole them, huh?
Right, and he prevailed upon Coretta King to kind of speak out against this action, and I think they got some,
So how did you get into this biodiversity racket?
Well, I think I grew not more discouraged, but less hopeful about the ability of the nonviolent movement to reach enough people to transform that way of thinking. As I said earlier, paradigms change one death at a time. It just seemed to me that, the global warming, I won't call it a problem, it's a symptom, was accelerating, and that more attention needed to be spent on that. But I have, as I expressed earlier, fears that these divisions within our society are going to become fracture points as the pressures caused by changing climate impact more and more people, and not in a good way. So,
well, I want to thank you for showing up here, because this is, it's widened our discourse. We haven't had this particular range of topics so far, I think. And I hope we come back to it, because I think my main motivation is the sense that all of these global threats are connected, and we should all be mindful of how they're connected. And so we need to be a little bit aware of what's going on in such discoveries as you just earlier on, you mentioned some of these things about platforms in the ocean to help the place to attach themselves and so on. So thank you very much for that, and thank everybody else. I think we've covered a lot of ground today, and I'm glad that everybody's been here. Next time, come back.
This conversation is one of the weekly series Talk About Saving the World, produced by Peace Magazine and Project Save the World. Please visit our website at tosavetheworld.ca, where you can sign the Platform for Survival, a list of 25 public policy proposals that, if enacted, would greatly reduce the risk of 6 global threats to humankind. Come back next week for another discussion of a serious global issue.